Can you just briefly give us a sense of, do you think this is genius or insanity on Hitler's part to think that he can take on probably what's perceived as to be the most powerful military in the world, which is the French military, or at least in Europe?
I think his hatred for the French was very, very deep. He really wanted to go to war with them. It was an ideological, irrational decision. That's why he didn't hate the empire. He kind of looked down, he admired it and looked down on.
You mean the British Empire?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the French he really hated, and France had been the Erbfeind, the genetic enemy of the German people. At least right-wingers would say so. There had been 2 wars. The first one Germany had won, then First World War Germany had lost. So Hitler wanted to kind of revenge and also stop the Versailles Treaty. So he really needed to attack the West, at least in his mindset. But it was an irrational decision, and that's why High Command said, no, we're not going to do it, basically. And Hitler's position at the time was not that he could do anything he wanted. I mean, High Command is still a High Command of the German Wehrmacht. That's a very old, it's a tradition. It's they do whatever they want, but also they have to obey Hitler's orders. So it's a power struggle, basically. But to invade France was a totally stupid idea. But it changed on the morning of February 17th, 1940. Hitler invited 3 young tank generals to his office, and they had a plan, which was the plan to go through the Ardennes Mountains. That was the victorious idea. So it's not the drugs. Actually, that idea to go through the Ardennes Mountain, if you think monocausal, you would say that's the reason. That idea was genius, and Hitler immediately understood it. Because before, the plan was to attack in the north of Belgium, which is the same as World War I. And it comes a stalemate, and they fight for months, and no one really moves, and it's bloody, and nothing's happening. It's bad. But that was the only plan that they had. That's why the High Command said, no, we're not going to do it. It's stupid. But these 3 tank generals, they had kind of like, somehow they were able to snuck into Hitler's office, and they said, look, if we go with the whole army through the Ardennes Mountains, and like Hitler, hey, this is not possible. This is like a mountain range. How can the whole German army fit through this eye of a needle, basically? And they said, no, we can do it, because everyone misunderstands what tanks can do. Tanks are not slow machines in the back that kind of wait for the action to happen and then, support this somehow. We're going to use tanks in the front as race cars, basically. We're going to overpower the enemy. We're going to be in France before the French, who are stationed all with the British in northern Belgium and also on the Maginot Line, but not really in the Ardennes Mountains. That was hardly fortified because no one could imagine that Germany would go through there. And before they know it, we are already behind them, basically. We are already in France, and they're still hanging out in northern Belgium, because it takes quite a while, to travel. Mm-hmm. This was a different time also. So he was convinced, and he then ordered the attack. The attack would happen. And that is then, it would only work if you would reach Sedan, the border city of France, within 3 days and 3 nights. So the whole army, or at least, the avant-garde of the machinery, had to be like a big part of the army had to be in Sedan after 3 days and 3 nights. And that was only possible if you don't stop. And that was the problem. The sleep was really then suddenly became a huge problem. And Hitler said, when I was fighting in World War I, of course I could stay awake for a week. I'm a German. Even though he's not even German, he's Austrian. But that was a problem. But suddenly Ranke realized that his moment had come, because he had the recipe how people could stay awake for 3 days and 3 nights. So Ranke suddenly became, before that he was kind of an outsider, like the freak with the drug idea. Suddenly he became like, okay, tell us, how does it work? And he gave like lectures in front of the officers, and he wrote a stimulant decree where like a whole army is prescribed a drug, in this case methamphetamine, how much should be taken, at what intervals, what are the side effects. So this became a very big thing. And then Temmler had to deliver 35 million dosages to the front lines, which were not the front yet. I mean, it was they were stationed in the west of Germany, and then on May 10th, they took their methamphetamine and they started the surprise attack through the Ardennes Mountains.
So the 35 million dosages for the French campaign. I mean, we could probably talk for many hours about this particular campaign because it is, I think it's fair to say, the most successful military campaign from the German side.
Ended with a big mistake. Dunkirk.
Dunkirk.
It was brilliant up until that point. That is a turning point. That was the first big mistake Hitler did. And it also had to do with drugs.
We'll talk about it, but let's just link on this 3 days.
Right.
So we should also mention that's where Blitzkrieg really shined. So it wasn't just the tanks, it was the infantry, it was the aircraft moving very fast behind the French lines. I mean, what can you speak to just the execution of that campaign and the role of drugs in it? And it is, we should say, a really bold strategic decision to use meth. I mean, it's a big risk. There's a lot of risks taken here, which could be seen as military genius or military insanity, and or a mixture of both.
Well, they were very lucky that it all worked out. Like it, also the guys in the tanks could all have freaked out on the meth, because then it was never tested before. Can you actually be in a combat situation in a tank in enemy territory on meth? Can people actually cope with that and be better fighters?
Going through the mountains.
It's like insane. Yeah.
Against the biggest military in Europe.
Well, what meth does is, because I read reports of the depressed atmosphere right before the attack started, because they were afraid. They thought they would lose. Like, they didn't want that. Soldiers, maybe some, really hardcore Nazi soldiers, but most people were just normal guys. They didn't want to start that. But once they had the methamphetamine, it kind of, you're like in a party mood. So also when you're in the tank, and everyone likes it, it's rather an uplifting thing. Like they were really getting into it, and they were really, they started fighting. Then is also an intoxication. It's a rush.
Like what does meth feel like?
Well, meth creates the so-called fight or flight modus. So either it releases all the neurotransmitters in the brain, which are released in situations of high danger, for example. So in a highly dangerous situation, you become very alert, so you can cope with the situation. If you're under life threat and you don't even react to it, you're probably gonna be dead, But the body does that, and methamphetamine does that. So you take a pill of methamphetamine, or you snort a line of methamphetamine, and you're like this. And then it's the fight or flight mode. Either you run away, like it's too much, but on meth, you usually don't run away. You kind of think it's really cool what's happening. You like to move, you like to be with your pals, you like to, be in a tank's great.
So there is a party aspect to it.
I think it was very joyful for the German soldiers because it was springtime. They had immediate successes. And it wasn't heavy fighting. It was just being in the tank. I mean, there was, of course, fighting, and there were also war crimes. And I read a report when Rommel, high on meth, like at night, doesn't stop, of course, because they're all, they don't stop at night. But every army usually stops at night. So the French army were stopping. They were in a village, camping out, and the German Rommel was going with the tank through that village with his division, just running over people. And he was standing like in the open lid of the tank, and he was like going through that thing, and like a berserk type of warrior. And that was when, that to me is a war crime. That is when the Wehrmacht lost its innocence in that push of Rommel through the French countryside, because you don't do that. Your enemy is sleeping. Because the French also had a drug regulation. They received 3/4 of a liter of red wine per man per day. So of course at night they're going to be sleepy on red wine, and the Germans were like on meth, and they were just running over them. There's descriptions of the chains of the tank becoming bloody. I don't think he did it, and he was like, "Oh my God, what did I just do? I'm sorry. What am I doing here?" He was in the movie.
This is the dark thing about human nature, that in war, if you allow your brain to dehumanize the enemy, the opponent, the humans on the other side, you can actually, I think hate can take over. And in that hate, you can find pleasure when you murder the other. And people have written about this, have talked about this. It's probably a thing that a person like me can't possibly comprehend unless I experienced it. And you have to be in the mania, in the hysteria, in the insanity, intensity of war.
I mean, what Evans, for example, said is that I excuse the Germans of the war crimes because they were just in an intoxication. I understand that argument, but if you look at individual soldiers, it's quite tricky. Like, it's a 19-year-old guy. He's been drafted, and in Nazi Germany, if you don't go, you land in a concentration camp. So you can choose, concentration camp, or you just join the ranks, and then you get pervitin, and then you invade France. There was a trial in Germany because someone said all soldiers are murderers. And I think then the German Bundeswehr sued him, no, soldiers are not murderers. And he actually won in court. So it's legal in Germany to call every soldier a murderer. But it's a tricky question.
Yeah, I remember seeing the documentary on the ordinary people. There's also social pressure. Again, insane it is to say, I think the documentary Ordinary People was looking at the Germans that were part of the shooting squads.
Mm.
And, they didn't understand what they're signing up for. And they were told that they're free to leave once they understand what they're doing. And many of them didn't. And they didn't have hate for Jews or for the people who they're murdering. You are, again, a 19, 20-year-old young kid. It's so hard to comprehend the moral insanity that's happening all around you. And you just kind of want to fit in.
I mean, that's why I wrote the book, The Bohemians, because there were a few people in Berlin that didn't react this way, but they reacted in a different way. They said, we cannot be part of this.
But it's hard to be the
It's
person.
very hard, yeah. And most people are part of it because it's much more safe, or at least it seems more safe. I mean, it has its own perils, because you might become a genocidal murderer, that might happen. Are you responsible? I would say you are responsible, but that's just my personal gut feeling. I always thought my grandfather was responsible for the genocide because he was working for the German railway system, and he once saw a train car full of Jews in a cattle wagon. And he only said to me, yeah, this was against German railway regulations. And I said, so what did you do? And he said, well, there were SS at the station where I was working, and I was too scared. I didn't do anything. So I thought that he made himself guilty, I thought. And my father, for example, reacted very strongly because of that. He never called him by his first name, the father of his wife, because he still had that, he was a Nazi because he was working for the railway. So I wouldn't excuse people, actually, and I certainly would not excuse high-ranking politicians that make policies, because the genocidal policies that the Nazis developed and the war policies that they developed had nothing to do with drugs. And I never write that in any, because there's no documents. If I would find documents that say, yeah, but the Nazi ideology has nothing to do with drugs, maybe with alcohol, but it's. And I spoke with my father, who had been a high judge in Germany. What does actually the law say? And the law says if you plan a crime, and then maybe when you commit it, you are under the influence, it does not diminish your responsibility. Your responsibility is only diminished. Let's say you're a totally normal person, never done any harm to anybody, and suddenly you take a drug or you're totally drunk and you don't know what you're doing and you kill someone. Then a judge could say maybe you have a lesser responsibility. But this is not the case with the crimes of National Socialism. And I never even hint at that in my book. So I think that criticism by Evans was short-sighted. I think he's he's not right about that.
Yeah, I think I agree with you totally. I didn't get that sense.
He thought the book was very successful because a lot of right-wing people bought it, but that's simply not true.
I think your book did a masterful job of never making itself amenable to that kind of narrative.
To the contrary, I got an angry letter by a German army employee, quite a high officer, and a military historian, and he said that he also thought I overemphasized the drug use of the methamphetamine in the Western campaign, because he said the German army was just so good, and you kind of diminish their capability by saying they were only so good because they took methamphetamine. I thought that was kind of funny, because the Wehrmacht doesn't exist anymore, and the current German army is called the Bundeswehr, and they're not supposed to be connected. Like, there was a clear cut, but he still felt that I was kind of hurting the pride of the Wehrmacht. So
I generally sort of agree with him. In general, it seems like great historians often. I'm just a human, so I'm not a historian, but they undermine the importance of the heroes that make up an army. The Soviet army, the British army, the French army, the German army. Like, these are humans. And some of the great military campaigns involve people really stepping up. Now, like the effectiveness of the military tactics with Blitzkrieg, the effectiveness of meth, the strategic decisions around where to invade, the timing, the speed, all of those are important. But there's humans there. There's real heroes. And sometimes historians kind of diminish that. I don't know what to make sense of it. I might be just an idiot, but I've had a great conversation with James Holland. I've gotten to know him well. He kind of analyzed the mistakes made by Hitler and by Stalin in the Operation Barbarossa. But I just, through generations, because I grew up in the Soviet Union, you hear these stories of these heroes. You know, my grandfather was a machine gunner and miraculously survived. And like, just knowing those stories, Stalingrad would not have happened without the heroes on the Soviet side. And it's easy to say there's a lot of blunders, a lot of bad tactics, all this kind of stuff. But to me, from the human side, I just know through my bloodline the people that have fearlessly given their life to defend their homeland. And that sometimes could be a little bit easily dismissed. So I don't know what to make sense of it. Maybe I'm romanticizing, or maybe I'm speaking to the suffering that the people have felt, and they just propagate themselves through my life story, and then maybe the gratitude I have for the people who have stopped the Nazi forces.
I think it's amazing what the Russian soldiers actually did, because they beat the Wehrmacht. It was really the Red Army on the ground that did the job, you know. And did they love communism and their system? I don't think so. And I think they were, I mean, of course, some people, but basically they were defending their country. And I'm also very grateful to them.
Yeah, they're defending their families.